The first snow of December had just begun to fall when old Ethan Miller dropped to his knees beside the barn, clutching the trembling body of his favorite mule, Holly. The lantern he carried slipped from his hand and rolled across the frozen ground, casting shaky light on the scene as a cold wind cut through the night like a warning. "Holly, stay with me, girl," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking as the mule let out a weak, broken bray. Her breathing was shallow, her legs stiff, and the frost on her muzzle showed she'd been outside longer than she should have. But Ethan had found her too late, lying by the broken fence, as if she'd been trying to make her way back home through the biting cold. The old farmer pressed his forehead against hers, tears slipping onto her grey fur. "Lord, don't take her. Not now. Not my Holly. Not tonight." Inside the barn, the other animals stirred anxiously, cows shifting their weight, chickens fluttering on their perches, the old sheepdog whining as if he understood the urgency. Snowflakes drifted into the barnyard like silent witnesses while the wind continued to groan through the empty fields. Ethan gathered Holly's head in his hands, rocking gently, desperate for warmth, desperate for a miracle. His heart pounded as the mule's breaths grew slower and slower until the night felt unbearably still. A single bell rang in the distance, perhaps from the small white church at the end of the road, perhaps from somewhere unseen. Ethan lifted his head, shaken by the sound, as if heaven itself had nudged him to look up. But before we speak of that bell, it didn't start there. We must go back a little in time. If this story is already touching your heart, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And before we continue, comment these words of faith. "I trust God even in the cold seasons." Let's keep walking this journey of hope together. The weeks before that winter night had carried the quiet rhythm of country life on the outskirts of Maple Creek, a small American town tucked between rolling hills and thick pine woods. It was the kind of place where church bells set the pace of Sunday mornings, where folks waved from porches, and where an honest day's labor was still worth more than a loud man's promises. Ethan Miller, 72, rose every morning before the sun had a chance to color the sky. His house was old, worn smooth by decades of wind and seasons, but it stood faithfully, just like he did. He'd lived there since he returned from serving in the army many years ago, choosing a life of soil, animals, and quiet faith over the noise of the world. The barn creaked softly when he pushed the door open each dawn. "Morning, everyone," he'd say with a warm, sleepy chuckle, as though speaking to family. And in truth, he believed he was. There was Daisy, the slow-moving cow with gentle eyes, Patch, the sheepdog with more grey than black on his muzzle, a few hens with fiery personalities, and of course Holly, the mule who had carried Ethan's burdens, literal and emotional, for more than 10 years. She had a stubborn heart, but a loyal one, and she knew his voice better than anyone. Ethan's days were simple but full, repairing fences, tending the soil, stacking firewood, checking the creek for fallen branches. When the weather grew cold, he spent more time in the workshop behind the house, mending old tools with steady hands and whispering prayers under his breath. His Bible, worn and soft on the edges, stayed open on the little table beside the wood stove. Each night he read a chapter before bed, letting the words settle into him like warm soup. He lived alone, yes, but he never felt abandoned. He felt watched over. Around Maple Creek, Ethan was the kind of man people respected quietly. Younger folks often said, "If you want a bit of real wisdom, ask Mr. Miller." And older folks would smile and respond, "He listens before he speaks. That's why God trusts him with answers." Holly the mule had a special place in that little farm story. Ethan had rescued her years ago from a man who thought work animals were machines without feelings. Holly had arrived trembling, thin, and afraid of raised hands. Ethan spent months just talking to her, hand-feeding her, standing beside her silently as she learned that not all humans meant harm. "God gave you a good heart, girl," he often whispered into her mane. You just needed a place to rest. And rest she did. She worked the fields, pulled small loads, and accompanied Ethan on long walks through the property. She listened better than most people, Ethan liked to say with a wink. That autumn had been especially cold, sending the birds south early and frosting the fields before Thanksgiving. But Ethan, a man who'd weathered more winters than he cared to count, simply pulled on his old coat and thanked God for keeping him able. The small white church at the end of Maple Road had begun decorating for Christmas. Paper stars in the windows, pine wreaths on the doors, candles glowing during evening prayer meetings. Ethan attended every Wednesday night, sitting in the same creaky pew halfway back. He never liked being up front. He preferred to blend in, to listen, to feel the weight of the hymns settle on his shoulders. One evening, Pastor Samuel Hall approached him after service. "Ethan, Christmas is coming," he said with that knowing smile. "Don't spend it alone. Come eat with us at the parsonage." Ethan chuckled softly. "I appreciate it, Pastor, but Holly doesn't like me gone long." Pastor Hall laughed. "You've got that mule spoiled." "She spoiled me first," Ethan replied, and the two men shared a moment of gentle understanding. But even in those peaceful weeks, small signs had begun appearing, signs that Holly wasn't herself. Ethan noticed her slowing down on small tasks, breathing heavier after short walks, standing longer in the mornings before taking her first steps. Nothing dramatic, just different. He brushed her gently one late afternoon as the sun dipped behind the pines. "You tired, girl?" he murmured, smoothing her coat. Holly leaned her head against his shoulder, a tender gesture that made his heart ache in a way he couldn't explain. Patch barked once, sharply in the distance, sensing something Ethan couldn't yet see. The wind that day carried a hint of coming storms, and the sky had a strange, pale color, winter's quiet warning. Everything still seemed manageable then, peaceful, calm. But the seeds of the coming miracle and the fear before it were already being planted in the soil of Maple Creek. And soon, one December night, everything would change. As December settled deeper into Maple Creek, Ethan found himself lingering longer beside Holly's stall, brushing her with slow, careful strokes. The barn smelled of pine shavings and old wood, familiar comforts, but Holly's labored breathing added a quiet tension to the air. One crisp morning, frost etched white lace on the windows of the barn. Ethan opened the door with his usual greeting, "Morning, everyone." But his voice softened when he reached Holly. She lifted her head, but only just. Her ears twitched, but not with their usual alertness. Something fragile hung inside her eyes. Ethan knelt beside her, running a hand gently along her neck. "You're scaring me a little, girl," he whispered, "but we've weathered storms before." The truth, the one he didn't want to name, had been stirring in his heart. Holly was getting old. Age had a way of slipping in quietly, then suddenly asking its price. Later that day, as the sun dipped gold over the fields, Ethan stepped outside, hands stuffed in his pockets, shoulders heavy beneath his coat. Patch followed him, tail low, sensing his unease. The farmer walked toward the old wooden fence overlooking the creek, a spot he often visited when thoughts grew too heavy for the house. He leaned against the rail, hat pulled low, and finally let the truth rise to the surface. "I don't want to lose her, Lord," he said softly, staring into the fading light. "That mule, she's been more faithful than most folks I've known." Patch rested beside him, whining quietly as if echoing the prayer. Ethan closed his eyes. The cold wind brushed his face, but he didn't flinch. He felt the weight of time, of memories, of every plowed field and every silent morning spent beside Holly. "I'm not asking for riches. I'm not asking for youth or strength or even a long life for myself," he murmured. I just want one thing this Christmas. Let her stay with me a little longer. Let her see another spring. If it's your will, Lord, I'm asking humble." He took a slow breath, letting the prayer settle between him and heaven. When he opened his eyes again, he saw nothing miraculous, just the quiet creek, the bare trees, and a hawk circling lazily overhead. But something inside him shifted, not hope. He'd always held that. Not certainty, no man truly has that. But a quiet trust, a willingness to wait on God's timing, even if the answer hurt. That evening, while tending the fire in the house, Ethan pulled out his Bible. The page fell open to a verse he knew well. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. He traced the words with a weathered finger, whispering them aloud. Holly's faint bray floated into the living room, muffled through the barn walls. Ethan smiled softly. I hear you, girl. He spent the next hour writing a modest Christmas wish list on a scrap of paper, a habit he'd kept since childhood. At the top, above warm socks, a new pocket knife and a bag of feed, he wrote, "A miracle for Holly, just one more season." He stared at the words for a long time. His dream wasn't grand, wasn't selfish, wasn't impossible. It was simply tender, a man asking God to spare a friend with 4 legs, a stubborn heart, and a loyalty that only animals and angels seem to understand. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, heaven had already begun to move. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in the slow, steady way God works when love is sincere and faith is quiet. The winter deepened faster than anyone in Maple Creek expected. The temperature dropped so sharply that the creek froze solid long before Christmas lights appeared in town. The cold seemed to settle into everything, the soil, the windows, the bones of old houses, and the fragile body of a tired mule. For Ethan Miller, the days began to feel heavier, as though each sunrise carried a quiet warning. Holly's condition worsened slowly at first. She ate less, she stood less, she breathed harder. Her once bright eyes grew dim, not with fear, but with exhaustion. One morning, Ethan walked into the barn with a bucket of warm mash, only to find her lying down longer than usual. He knelt beside her, brushing straw from her coat. "Come on, girl, take a little," he whispered, lifting the bucket. Holly sniffed at the food, nudged it half-heartedly, then turned her head away. A soft tremor ran through her legs. Ethan bowed his head, letting a deep ache settle in his chest. Patch the sheepdog lay nearby, ears drooping, watching with silent concern. The barn, usually full of gentle morning noise, felt too still. That afternoon, Ethan hitched up his old truck and drove into town to pick up medicine from the small farm supply store. The clerk, Linda Pearson, looked at him with kind eyes as she rang up the items. "Holly's not doing too well, is she?" she asked softly. Ethan tugged at the brim of his hat. "She's got more heart than body left, just trying to give her a fair fight." Linda leaned forward. "You've done right by that mule for years, Ethan. If anyone can nurse her through a rough winter, it's you." Her words were kind, but they sank into him like stones. Kindness often hurts more when it's true. When he got home, he spent the rest of the day tending to Holly, warming blankets, medicine, fresh water, gentle brushing. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man performing a sacred ritual. As night fell early, snow began drifting against the barn doors. Ethan didn't bother going inside the house. He set up a small cot in the barn, wrapped himself in an old quilt, and slept beside Holly, or tried to. All through the night he woke to check on her, adjusting her blanket, holding her head, whispering comfort, praying. At one point, near midnight, he rested his hand on her neck and whispered, "If God's ready to take you, Holly, I won't fight him, but I ain't ready to lose you." The mule let out a soft, trembling breath, almost as if answering. The next days were a blur of worry. Ethan barely ate. He barely slept. He went through the motions of farm chores like a man moving underwater. Every heartbeat seemed tied to Holly's. The first big storm of the season rolled in on a Thursday evening, wind howling through the rafters like an ancient cry. Snow piled high against the barn walls, trembling the windows. Ethan sat wrapped in his coat beside Holly, listening to the storm slam against the world outside. He was tired, physically, yes, but more so in spirit. There's a kind of exhaustion that only comes from watching someone you love slowly slip away. He placed one hand on Holly's muzzle. "I don't know what else to do, Lord," he whispered. "I've given her everything I got." The storm raged louder. "Feels like my prayers are hitting the roof and falling right back down." Patch whined softly in the corner. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the beams. The barn creaked. Holly's breathing rasped in and out, each breath sounding like a battle. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes, rare for him, unwelcome but unstoppable. He bowed his head, shoulders shaking. "I'm not asking for a sign, Lord, just a little mercy, just a little strength, for her or for me, whichever you see fit." He stayed like that for a long time, head bowed, hand resting on the mule that had carried him through countless seasons, but the night offered no miracle. The next morning, Holly stood, but only barely, leaning against the stall wall for support. She looked at Ethan with tired eyes that seemed to say, "I'm trying, but I'm tired." Ethan nodded as though he understood. "We'll keep walking this road, girl, one step at a time." Yet inside, a fear gnawed at him, a quiet dread that he might not be able to walk that road much longer. Days passed like this, worry, hope, exhaustion, prayer. Each sunrise brought a little more weakness, a little less movement from Holly. Christmas was drawing closer, but joy felt far away. Every night Ethan stepped outside the barn to gaze at the sky, breath fogging in the cold. The stars looked distant, the world felt indifferent, but still he whispered, "I'm holding on, Lord, even when it hurts." His faith didn't break that week, but it bent, quietly, painfully, under the weight of love and fear, and the storm of life was about to meet another storm, one wearing the face of injustice. Snow still blanketed Maple Creek like a heavy quilt when the second trial arrived, not from nature, but from people. And as it often happens, the coldest winds don't always blow from the sky. Ethan was brushing Holly one quiet afternoon when he heard the crunch of tires on snow. He stepped out of the barn, tightening his coat, and saw a shiny black truck approaching the property. It rolled up too slowly, too confidently, like someone surveying what didn't belong to them. Behind the wheel was Caleb Turner, a younger man in town known for two things: smooth words and rough intentions. Caleb had a reputation for pushing his way into deals that weren't his, buying land cheap from struggling farmers, flipping it, and bragging about smart business. He stepped out of the truck wearing a new coat, smug grin already in place. "Afternoon, Mr. Miller," he called, slamming the door. Ethan nodded once. "Caleb." Caleb eyed the barn, then the fields, then Ethan himself. "Heard your mule ain't doing well. Tough break." The tone wasn't sympathy. It was opportunity. Ethan's jaw tightened. "She's fighting. That's all that needs saying." Caleb stuffed his hands in his pockets, rocking back on his heels. "Look, let's talk straight. This land's too much for one man your age, especially when your best work animal's going downhill. Winter like this," he shook his head dramatically. "Hard to keep up." Ethan stayed silent, knowing exactly where this was going. Caleb smirked. "I'm willing to take some burden off you. Make you a fair offer. You sell me the north field, the one near the creek, and I'll give you enough cash to get through winter. Maybe even get yourself a new mule come spring." Ethan didn't blink. "The north field ain't for sale." Caleb clicked his tongue. "Come on now. It's sitting there, half frozen. You need help. I'm trying to give you a way out." Ethan looked him straight in the eyes. "Son, I need many things this winter, but giving away land God entrusted to me ain't one of 'em." Caleb's smile flickered, revealing irritation beneath the surface. "Suit yourself, but things get tough out here. Storms, vet bills, repairs. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You might change your mind when Holly finally drops. The words cut sharper than ice. Ethan stepped forward, not angrily, but firmly. Holly's not a tool for your bargains, and neither am I. You're done here. Something cold flashed in Caleb's eyes. Fine, he said, climbing back into his truck. Don't say I didn't warn you. He drove off, wheels spitting snow behind him. Ethan watched until the truck disappeared, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He'd faced storms before, but greed was a different kind of weather. A week later, Ethan discovered the first sign of trouble. The fence along the creek was damaged, freshly. The rails weren't broken from age or wind. They had been cut deliberately, leaving a gap wide enough for animals to wander off. Ethan stared at the saw marks, breathing slowly through rising frustration. Patch sniffed the ground, growling low. Tracks in the snow proved someone had been there, someone wearing boots far newer than Ethan's. Trying to make me desperate, Ethan whispered. If Holly had wandered out that night, weak as she was, she might never have found her way back. Caleb's face came to mind, but Ethan pushed it away. Lord, he muttered, give me patience. Don't let anger take root. He repaired the fence with stiff, cold hands, even as his heart churned. 2 days later, Ethan walked into town for supplies. When he returned home, Patch barked madly from the barn. Ethan rushed inside to find Holly trembling, drenched in cold sweat. Someone had left the barn door open wide, letting the freezing wind whip inside. Snow covered the floor. Holly's blanket had been ripped off the hooks and tossed aside, as though someone had yanked it down on purpose. Ethan hurried to her, wrapping her in warmth, whispering, "Easy, girl, I'm here, I'm here." Patch growled in the doorway, sniffing tracks in the snow leading away from the barn. Ethan closed his eyes, forehead resting against Holly's neck. Why, Lord, why does trouble always kick a man when he's down? He knew the answer in his heart. The righteous are tested not only by storms, but by people who benefit from their weakness. But Ethan refused to cave. He secured the barn, checked every lock, and sat beside Holly long into the night. She leaned against him weakly, and he hummed an old hymn his mother used to sing. Out in the dark, the cold wind hid silent footsteps retreating down the road. 2 days before Christmas, Ethan drove into Maple Creek to buy more medicine. As he stepped out of the store, he saw Caleb leaning against his truck, arms crossed. "Your fence break again?" Caleb asked casually. "Heard there's coyotes out by the creek." Ethan didn't respond. Caleb smiled wider. "And that barn door, old hinges give out in winter, dangerous for a weak animal." Ethan's eyes narrowed, not with rage, but with something stronger, sorrow. "Caleb," he said quietly, "I don't know what you've been doing, but I do know this. Greed will take more from you than land ever could." Caleb scoffed. "You want pity? Sell me that field and you'll be sleeping easier?" Ethan lifted his chin. "I'd rather lose everything than make a deal born of fear." Caleb's expression hardened. "Then you will lose everything." He walked off, leaving those words behind like poison in the snow. Ethan stood still, breath slow and heavy. Trouble was closing in on him from every side: weather, sickness, exhaustion, and now a man who wanted to break him. As he drove home, the sky turned grey, heavy with another storm. Ethan clutched the steering wheel tighter. "Lord," he whispered, "I'm trying to stay honest. I'm trying to stay faithful, but my heart is getting tired." The wind moaned through the trees. Snow began to fall, and in the barn Holly breathed shallowly, waiting for him. The injustice had reached its peak, but God's justice, quiet, patient, and certain, was already on its way. The morning of December 23rd arrived wrapped in steel-grey clouds. The cold was biting, sharp enough to sting the lungs, but Ethan stepped out of his house quietly, as he always did, ready to tend to Holly. His heart felt heavy, weighted by sleepless nights and bitter confrontations, yet even in sorrow he whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for another day." He reached the barn, opened the door gently, and murmured, "Morning, girl." Holly lifted her head weakly. It was enough to make him smile, but before he could reach her, a sound echoed in the distance, a frantic shout, a man's voice, desperate, panicked. "Help! Somebody!" Ethan froze. Patch barked sharply and darted outside, paws flying over the snow. The cries grew louder. "Help! Help!" Ethan hurried to the fence line, and there, stumbling down the slope toward the creek, was Caleb Turner. His face was flushed with fear, his clothes torn, and behind him, the ice on the creek had broken into jagged pieces. Ethan didn't hesitate. He rushed down the hill, boots slipping on patches of ice. "Caleb, what happened?" Caleb pointed behind him with trembling hands. "My truck. I tried to cross the creek. The ice gave out. The whole front end stuck under. I almost fell in." Ethan glanced toward the creek. The black truck was tilted dangerously, nose first into freezing water, steam rising from the engine. One wrong step and Caleb might have been dragged under. Ethan reached him, steadying him by the shoulders. "Easy now. You hurt?" Caleb shook his head, breath visible in frantic bursts. No, I thought the ice was thick enough. I thought—" Ethan didn't let him finish. "Come on," he said, guiding him up the hill. "Let's get you warm." Inside the barn, Caleb sat on an overturned bucket while Ethan wrapped an old wool blanket around his shoulders. Patch stood nearby, watching him with suspicious eyes. Holly, even in her weakness, stirred softly as if sensing the shift in the air. Caleb rubbed his face, ashamed and shivering. Ethan finally spoke, gently but firmly. "Caleb, what were you doing out by the creek? That's not the road to town." Caleb swallowed hard, guilt rising in his eyes. I thought I could reach the north field from the back way. I wanted to check the soil before making you another offer." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And the cut fence, the open barn door." Caleb's shoulders slumped. He didn't deny it. "I thought, if things looked worse for you, maybe you'd sell. I figured a man your age couldn't keep up forever." The confession hung in the air like a cold draft. Ethan sighed, not loudly, not angrily, just deeply. "Caleb, greed's a trap, and you stepped in your own." Caleb lowered his head. "I know. I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. I really am." Ethan studied him. The younger man seemed smaller now, not in size but in spirit, stripped of the pride that had blinded him. "Listen to me," Ethan said, voice low with earnest weight. "Land bought with deceit don't keep its value, and a man who tears down others builds nothing for himself." Caleb's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the sting of truth. "I could have died out there," he murmured. Ethan nodded slowly. "And still God saw fit to pull you out. That ought to tell you something." The barn fell quiet except for Holly's soft breath. Caleb rose to his feet. "Mr. Miller, I'll fix the fence, and the barn door, and anything else I broke, I swear it." Ethan simply replied, "Make sure your words better than your intentions." Caleb nodded, humbled. "It will be—" He stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath his boots, leaving behind the man he used to be and walking toward the man he could still become. Ethan watched him go, feeling a strange peace settle over him. The injustice had collapsed under its own weight, not through Ethan's hands, but through God's quiet timing. He turned back to Holly, gently touching her mane. "See that girl?" he whispered. "The proud fall and the humble rise. God sorts things out better than we ever could." But while one storm had passed, Ethan didn't know another miracle was already forming. one meant for him, a miracle that would arrive right on time. Christmas Eve dawned with a hesitant, pale light creeping across the hills of Maple Creek. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. Snow blanketed everything, fields, rooftops, fences, with a purity that softened even the harshest lines of winter. Ethan stepped out of his house, boots crunching in the crisp morning snow. His breath formed clouds that drifted upward like small prayers. He whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for bringing us through another night." But his gratitude carried a fearful edge. Holly's breathing had weakened again during the early hours. She had barely moved. Even her eyes, usually so expressive, seemed to flicker with fading strength. Inside the barn, the cold nipped at Ethan's cheeks as he leaned over her. "Morning, girl," he murmured, brushing her forehead. She shifted slightly, enough to acknowledge him. Patch lay beside her, chin between his paws, watching the mule with quiet devotion. Ethan knelt and checked her blanket, adjusting it gently. Holly's breathing rasped shallowly. She had fought long and hard, but her body was failing. Ethan felt it, he knew it, and the weight of that truth settled heavily over him. "Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling, "if you're calling her home, give me strength to accept it. But if there's still a miracle left in heaven's pocket, open it today." He bowed his head, forehead resting lightly on Holly's neck. Tears, warm, uninvited, slipped down his weathered face. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the barn doors, carrying with it the distant sound of church bells from Maple Creek. Christmas Eve bells. Ethan lifted his head slowly. Bells at this hour. The sound grew clearer, more melodic, drifting across the snowy fields like a soft summons. Patch's ears perked up. Holly shifted, just a little, but enough that Ethan noticed. "Holly," he whispered. Her ears twitched, her breathing steadied, just slightly, but noticeably. Ethan frowned, confused. He placed his hand against her neck. Her skin felt warmer than it had overnight, warmer than it should have been in a barn chilled by winter. He looked up. The barn windows glowed faintly, not with sunlight, it was too early for that, but with a golden hue he couldn't quite explain. The light shimmered for a moment, soft like candle glow. Patch whimpered, not in fear, but in awe. Ethan stepped back, heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in weeks, hope. A sudden gust blew the barn doors open wide, letting in a burst of sunlight, real sunlight this time, stronger, brighter, pushing through the clouds in a single beam that landed directly on Holly. The mule blinked as the light touched her. She raised her head, higher than she had in days. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. "Holly." She pushed her legs beneath her slowly. Patch stood up, tail wagging anxiously. "No, girl," Ethan whispered. "Don't force yourself." But Holly wasn't forcing anything. She was rising, first to her knees, then fully upright. She stood, steady and strong, head lifted as though the weight of winter had fallen off her shoulders. Her ears perked toward the open barn doors, where the sunlight continued pouring in. Ethan stared, speechless. Then Holly took a step, then another. Her legs didn't tremble. Her breathing was calm, full, steady. She walked toward Ethan and nudged his chest gently with her nose, just as she had done for years. Ethan staggered back, overcome. His hand shook as he touched her face. "How? Holly? How?" Patch barked joyfully, circling them. The church bells kept ringing in the distance, their notes rising and falling like a heavenly chorus carried by the wind. Ethan fell to his knees, not in despair this time, but in pure, overwhelming gratitude. He clasped his hands and whispered through trembling lips, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you. Thank you." Holly lowered her head, resting it against his shoulder. Warm, alive, strong. Ethan wept openly, tears falling into her mane. "You gave her back to me. You did, on Christmas Eve of all days." The sunlight brightened for a final moment, illuminating the barn in a soft golden glow, then slowly faded as the clouds closed again. But the miracle had already taken place. Holly was standing, breathing freely, eyes bright, strength restored. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't partial. It wasn't something a vet or medicine could explain. It was a gift, a quiet, perfect, right-on-time Christmas miracle. And Ethan felt it deep in his soul. God hadn't arrived early. He hadn't arrived late. He arrived exactly when he intended, exactly when Ethan needed him most. Christmas morning in Maple Creek felt different that year, not because the snow was deeper or the air was colder, but because Ethan Miller walked out of his barn with a grateful heart that seemed to warm the whole valley. Holly followed behind him at a steady pace, ears flicking, breath rising in gentle puffs of steam. She walked as though winter held no claim over her anymore, light, sure, renewed. Ethan paused at the fence line overlooking the frozen creek. He rested one hand on the rail, the other on Holly's mane, and whispered, "Lord, I won't ever forget what you did here." The sky above the hills was faintly pink, the kind of color that comes only on quiet mornings when heaven seems a little closer to earth. Birds chirped softly from the pine branches. Patch trotted happily in circles, barking at nothing but joy. Ethan looked at Holly and smiled. "You weren't late, Lord. Not a minute." He reflected quietly on the truth he had lived. That God's answers don't always come when the heart demands them, nor when fear insists on them, but when faith has settled deep enough to hold them gently. The world teaches hurry. Fear teaches panic, but God teaches timing. And in that humble barn on Christmas Eve, timing had become a miracle. Ethan found himself whispering old words that felt new again. "Those who wait in faith will never wait in vain." Holly nudged his shoulder as if agreeing, and the old farmer knew, without doubt, without question, that Christmas had come exactly when heaven intended it to, right on time. If this story touched your heart today, remember this: God is never rushed, never distracted, and never late. He arrives in the exact moment when our strength ends and His grace begins. Just like Holly stood again when hope seemed frozen, God can breathe life into the very places you thought were gone forever. So whatever you're praying for, healing, restoration, peace, a miracle of your own, hold on. Heaven is already moving, quietly, gently, perfectly on time. Before you scroll away, I want to invite you to declare your faith publicly, not for me, not for this video, but as a testimony that you still believe God can do the impossible. If this story spoke to your soul, write in the comments, "I believe God restores what seems lost." Let these words be your seed of faith today.